Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bop Stop. I'm Joe, and I'm here with Brendan.
Hi, I'm Brendan. This is a new show called Album Swap. I recommend Joe an album, he recommends me an album. We both go and review those albums. My goal is to get Joe to review the album I recommended him more positively than the album he recommended me. To start off this
Yeah.
week, I chose Velocity Design Comfort by Sweet Trip.
Velocity Design Comfort by Sweet Trip. This was released in 2003, and it's this very out there experimental. It's really hard to describe. It's this like glitchy, dreamy, shoegazy mix of like so many genres. You have IDM in there. There's a noise in there. There's so much creativity and color that comes through on all of these tracks. It's really impressive how fully realized the sound feels because it doesn't seem like there's anything that I've ever heard that's quite like this. Tracks have this very dreamy and encompassing feel is the best way I'd describe it. It's kind of like you're floating, like a pool of water is kind of how I describe the feel of a lot of the tracks. And they do a great job of incorporating this groovy sound throughout. You have a song like Disco, which has this really dancey and catchy beat to it.
Disco is just a really fun song. It's very danceable. It's probably one of the more upbeat songs on the album.
It's basically a Gorillaz song, but more noisy and chaotic, and also better. And you have like this very interesting contrast on a lot of the songs between these extremely fast-paced, glitchy, and noisy beats that are kinetic feeling, but they're contrasted with these very warm, sweet vocals and synths that often are kind of in the background. They kind of drown somewhat within the mix. So it feels like everything's together as one, especially on a song like Tekka, which is super glitchy and interesting while having this catchy and harmonious element to it that's really interesting. There's also songs that get into shoegaze, which is really interesting. Fruitcake and Cookies, the last third-ish of it, just breaks into shoegaze in this wonderful shoegazy feel.
I think the elements of shoegaze that they bring in definitely add to the dreamlike qualities and very relaxing qualities of the album. Like you said, this floating in a pool of water feeling.
These songs are also often very gorgeous sounding, very like pristine sounding almost is the best way to describe it. They have just a very beautiful characteristic to them that I think works really well. There's very little that I disliked on this album, almost nothing. The way that everything mixes together is really fantastic. I guess the only complaints is there's some longer tracks, or well, not some longer tracks, specifically International, which is probably my least favorite track, where there's still a dreamlike quality to it, but I guess not enough really happens at points. There's individual points that become more chaotic and interesting, but I think sometimes it's kind of just a bit aimless at points, I guess. Outside of that, I have very few complaints about it. It's just incredibly catchy. It has so much character to offer. It feels like it constantly switches genres, but it still feels like it's part of one album. It never feels out of place. It's mixed fantastically. There's so many interesting ideas that are explored and sounds that are used. I love the vocals throughout. They're very airy and light sounding.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Velocity Design Comfort is easily one of my favorite albums ever. It is so bright, it is so colorful. There's so much going on, there's so much to love about this album.
I recommended that Brendan listen to The Drift by Scott Walker.
I'm going to be reviewing The Drift by Scott Walker. This is Scott's 13th studio album. Came out in 2006. Nearly a decade, actually a little bit more than a decade than his previous album Tilt, which came out in 1995. The best way to describe its genre is avant-garde and experimental, although there are elements of noise and industrial, and I think some places here you can even find the pop roots that Scott Walker comes from. This album is very odd. If you've never heard Scott Walker before, I think this is a good place to start. I definitely would highly recommend this album. This is not my first taste of Scott Walker, although I had never approached this album prior to this review. I really love how weird and disturbing this album can get at points. in some capacity, although this album came out later, it reminds me of Daughters, You Won't Get What You Want.
Yeah, definitely. For me personally, it reminds me specifically of the opener to You Won't Get What You Want. How dark and disturbing sounding a lot of it is.
One of the general things that I really like about this album, and that I wish I saw more, is I like when it gets into the more noisy tracks, the more noisy side of things, because I think Scott's vocals contrast extremely well with industrial noise backing him. You do see quite a few tracks on this album. Specifically, I want to point out Jolson and Jones and Hand Me Ups, which are probably some of my favorite songs off the album because they are so noisy. I think that contrast just works incredibly well, and it's something I wish I saw more of. That being said, the tracks that are a bit less noisy, like Buzzers, fall flat because of that. There are some tracks here, they get into the longer side of things, specifically Clara and Q, which are both more than 10 minutes long. Clara is another track I want to shout out as being one of my favorites. I especially love the guest vocalist that Scott Walker brings in on this track to voice Clara. I love how that element adds another bit of contrast to the album, and I think part of what this album is all about is just creating these off-kilter noises and opposing them to each other. Q, which is the other very long track, is also one of my lesser favorites. I just don't think that there is enough going on in that song to sustain its 10-minute runtime. Another thing I want to say is that I really like this album. I like a lot of the tracks, and I wish it got more intense as the album went on, although I don't get that feel from the album. It doesn't have any sort of progression in terms of the sonic background that Scott is on. The lyrics, they get pretty disturbing at points, which definitely adds to the flavor of the album. That's mostly it for my comments on this album.
I really love the drift. This album's really unique. I don't think anyone except for Scott Walker could have made this. It's just constantly brooding. It's so dark and out there. Velocity Design, Comfort by Sweet Trip, I think is a really fantastic album. It's super fun and weird and dreamlike, and it has such a it's like great glitchy sound to it that I think is super unique and super interesting. And outside of me having problems with like one or two tracks, I think this album's really fantastic. This is a 9 to a 9.5. 9.5. I'm just gonna say 9.5.
Cool review, Joe.
Whoa.
Um,
Thank you, Brendan.
okay,
Cool.
so as for Scott Walker's The Drift, I enjoy this album a lot. However, I think there's some modifications I would make to it at the end of the day. There are times I want it to be noisier, I want it to be more intense, and there are times where it's just a bit too weird and out there for me, I think. Who knows? Maybe with time this can grow on me. Maybe the weirdness will make more sense in time. But as for right now, it's still a very good album. Would definitely highly recommend it. I'm feeling it's on the edge of 8 to 8.5, but I'll probably go with 8 if you were pressed.
All right. Well, that wraps up the episode. Thanks for watching, everyone. Click the thumbs up button to give it a like, I guess. I don't know. Just fucking do it. Please. We're desperate.